Over on Jaguar Gatorade, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about the 2003 Las Vegas Bowl, where the executive director wanted Colorado State to play and the selection committee wanted New Mexico. Let's just say that in this instance, democracy did not work, as the game was a disaster both on and off the field. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. Also, join me tomorrow night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play NFL trivia for a chance to win cash prizes. Link to play below. And now, on with our feature presentation. One of the most pressure-filled moments of the year is when you are officially on the clock. When the last team makes its pick and you're up, you now only have a select amount of time to decide who you want to take to help bolster your team and help you win a championship. It's a lot of pressure, especially when you have 100 different talking heads in the room with different opinions on who you should take, when you have players still on the board that you didn't expect, when you have positions of need but better players available in positions of less need, when you have players that you thought would be there but are now not, and when you have a running clock that, by round 4, is just 5 minutes in length. Not a lot of time to make a pick. For some perspective, in the time it takes you to listen to Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana in its entirety, you go from not even on the clock to dishing out a multi-year contract totaling 7 figures that could give you a steal or could be a complete waste. Again, that is a massive time crunch, especially if you're torn between 2 players the same way that Mary McGregor was torn between 2 lovers. So what if you just ignored the clock? What if the clock just didn't exist? You pretended as though it wasn't there and kept talking and deliberating as to who you wanted to take, even though your time had expired and multiple teams leapfrogged you. Well, to be honest, you look really stupid, especially if the player that you did this with did not pan out in the slightest bit, and the extra time, in reality, became a waste of time. Well, in 1995, that's exactly what the New York Giants did. In an incredible display of incompetence, they were on the clock in the 4th round, and let not 1, not 2, but 3 teams overtake them, and all for a player who wound up doing nothing in the NFL. This is the story behind the 1995 Giants and one of the stupidest moments in the over 85-year history of the NFL Draft. Before I talk about the incident in question, we need some context to understand what the Giants were planning on doing in the 1995 NFL Draft, specifically what position they were looking to upgrade and who they were targeting to do that. The 1994 season for the Giants was somewhat of a mixed bag, and that's putting it mildly. On one hand, they started the season off incredibly strong, beginning the year with a 3-0 record and showing no signs of slowing down from their surprising 1993 playoff run. On the other hand, they then dropped 7 consecutive games, falling to 3-7, going more than 2 months without a win, and being 3rd from the bottom in the NFC with 6 games to play, only ahead of Washington and Tampa Bay, both of whom were 2-8. They were dead in the water, sitting a 3 back of a playoff spot with 6 to go, and this looked like it had the makings of a truly disappointing season. On the third hand, they then won 6 in a row to finish the year at 9-7, only narrowly missing the postseason off of a tiebreaker with the Chicago Bears. Talk about a truly up-and-down season. As a side note, to learn more about the 1994 Giants and their crazy turnaround from 3-7 to 9-7, click the card in the upper right corner. So entering 1995, what did the Giants need to do more than anything if they wanted to have a winning record for the 3rd straight season and make it to the playoffs for the 2nd time in 3 years under head coach Dan Reeves? Outside of needing improvement at quarterback and needing Dave Brown to take the jump from year 1 as a starter to year 2, because he was a bit of a mess in 1994 by throwing more picks than touchdowns, perhaps the biggest thing that the Giants needed to do was upgrade the linebacker position, because it was pretty rough. New York finished in the bottom half of the league in rushing yards allowed and in yards per carry allowed, and it was a unit that only seemed like it was going to get worse in 1995 without any reinforcements. The 3 starters that the Giants had at linebacker in 1994 were Michael Brooks, Carlton Bailey, and Corey Miller. Bailey now found himself on the Carolina Panthers. Brooks was on the wrong side of 30, and had a somewhat noticeable drop-off from his incredible 1992 season, where he made the Pro Bowl with the Denver Broncos, and from his incredible 1993 season, where he was with the Giants and was named a 2nd-team All-Pro. And the other starter was Corey Miller, who had a great 1993 season, finishing with 6.5 sacks and 4 forced fumbles, which was the 5th most in the league. However, he did nothing in 1994, recording no sacks and no forced fumbles. The Giants tried upgrading the linebacker position in 1995 in free agency, but they did it with a reclamation project more than anything, as they signed Mike Kroll, who won Defensive Rookie of the Year in 1991, but by 1994 was not good at all, as he had just 39 tackles and no sacks. As things stood, one starting linebacker on the Giants was over 30 and was on the decline. and the other two starting linebackers had no sacks in 1994 and were only brought on because of what they did in the past, even if their recent work had been incredibly disappointing. Safe to say, the Giants need to get a linebacker in the draft. And after making 4 picks addressing other needs, taking 2 offensive linemen to try and protect Dave Brown, who got sacked roughly 11% of the time, a running back to bolster a rushing attack that was 25th out of 28 teams in yards per carry, and a defensive back to hopefully be a ball hawk after no player on the team had more than 3 interceptions, they were finally ready to address the linebacker position. And to fill this need of theirs, they had someone in mind. During the mid-1990s, there were very few teams in college football who were as consistently good, especially in the SEC, as the Tennessee Volunteers. Part of that reason was an absolutely suffocating defense. In 1992, Tennessee went 9-3 thanks to a defense that finished 18th out of 107 teams in Division 1A in points allowed, allowing just 16.3 points per game. They followed that up in 1993 with a 9-2-1 record and an even more suffocating defense that finished 8th in Division 1A, which was 14.6 points per game allowed, and by shutting out 2 opponents while holding 4 opponents to less than 7 points. And they followed that up in 1994 with an 8-4 record and a defense that once again finished inside the top 20, allowing just 17.3 points per game and ending the regular season with back-to-back shutouts against Kentucky and Vanderbilt. Tennessee found themselves consistently inside the top 25, and did so on the strength of a great defense. And perhaps no player on that defense over those 3 years was more important than the guy you've been watching this whole time. This is linebacker Ben Talley, and aside from just being a great player, he was extremely versatile. You could play him at linebacker, or you could play him at defensive end, as he did during the second half of the 1994 season, even winning SEC Defensive Player of the Week honors at one point after a shutout win against Vanderbilt, making him the first Tennessee defensive lineman since the great Reggie White back in 1983 to accomplish this feat. Anytime you do something that hadn't been done in over a decade, and the last person to do it was arguably the greatest defensive lineman of all time, you're doing something right. Talley was named a second-team All-Conference member in 1993 by the Associated Press, and was named a second-team All-Conference member in 1994 by both the coaches of the SEC and the Associated Press, when he finished 3rd on the team in tackles with 72. Ben Talley was one of the anchors of a very good Tennessee defense for a very long time, who could not only wrap up really well and excel in solo tackle situations, but could drop back into coverage and make a nice interception or pass breakup every now and then. His pass rushing skills weren't great, but he had a great frame at 6'3", 245 pounds, and was projected by many outlets as a second-round pick or a third-round pick. The Boston Globe even had Talley as one of the top 5 linebackers in the entire draft, which is extremely high praise. Mel Kiper wasn't quite as high on Talley, but still had him as a third-round pick. As a side note, if you want to learn more about a horrible prediction that Kiper made, where he completely misevaluated a player's draft stock by a whole 7 rounds, click the card in the upper right corner. And one Tennessee newspaper had Talley as a player who should be drafted by the end of the 3rd round. In other words, Talley was what you would consider today to be your prototypical day 2 pick, although it didn't quite work like that back in 1995. But by the end of the 4th round, somewhat surprisingly in the eyes of some, Talley was still on the board, and was still waiting for a team to call his phone, and was still waiting for his name to be called. The Giants just finished picking at pick number 128, and now we're back on the clock at pick number 130. And it was time for the Giants to make their move and take the Rocky Top linebacker. Or so we thought. Because what happens next is truly bizarre, and depending on how you want to look at it, incredibly stupid. How the NFL draft works is like this. Each team has a certain amount of time that they have to make a draft pick. It didn't used to be like that. It used to be that you could take all the time in the world to make up your mind, which is why the Dallas Cowboys once spent a whole 6 hours on the clock before they took Mel Renfro back in 1964. If you want to learn more about that, click the card in the upper right corner. Fortunately, that rule does not exist anymore, because everyone watching would die of exhaustion and boredom, so now you're on the clock. In the 4th round, the clock is set at 5 minutes. By the time that timer is up, you have to have a name written down on a card, and that card has to be turned in. If you don't have a name by that point, and time runs out, you get to pick whenever you get that name in. However, other teams can leapfrog you while they wait. As an example, if you have pick number 11 and you run out of time, then the team that has pick number 12 can leapfrog you if they turn their card in before you do. It is extremely rare nowadays for teams to run out of time and get leapfrogged, and when it happens, it's usually because there was a trade that they were trying to execute that fell through at the last minute. I talked about when it happened with the Houston Oilers and the Cleveland Browns back at the 1988 NFL Draft. So if you want to learn more about one rare time that a leapfrog happened, click the card in the upper right corner. I think it goes without saying, but you do not want to get leapfrogged. It means that the player you want could be taken. It makes you look incompetent and lazy. It makes you look disorganized. It makes you look like you have no idea what you're doing. You want to turn in the card on time before the clock runs out. And 99.9% of the time, that's exactly what happens, as the draft is a science for many teams when it comes to that and knowing how much time they have to conduct business. However, in 1995, when the Giants were on the clock at pick number 130, they decided that the clock was imaginary. They didn't have a care in the world, and they had an extremely bold strategy. What if we intentionally take more than 5 minutes so we can be absolutely sure that we make the right call here? When the Giants were on the clock, they seemed like they were set on taking Ben Talley out of Tennessee. But then, as discussions progressed in the war room, they became a bit less certain. As general manager George Young said on the talks going on in the war room, Talley had the misfortune of playing a lot of positions in college. He played up and down, left and right. It was hard to get a feel. Again, this seems like a conversation you should be having before you're on the clock and in the days and the weeks leading up to the draft. But this hesitation between Talley and an undisclosed player left the Giants in a pickle. They didn't know who to take, and they weren't picking again until pick number 153 in the 5th round. So it wasn't likely that the player they chose would not have been there by the time that they were on the clock again. With time running out, and with the team still torn, head coach Dan Reeves suggested the incredibly bold, or incredibly stupid strategy, depending on how you want to look at it. What if we just wait it out? What if we just keep talking and don't pick until we absolutely know for sure who we want? Somehow, and I don't know how, the people in the war room okayed this idea, and we're totally fine with letting the clock run out and letting teams leapfrog them while they still try to make up their mind. George Young said that this wasn't an accident. Rather, this was completely intentional, saying, "We were aware of the situation. It's not something you like to do, but sometimes it's better to finish the discussion than let the clock determine the pick." He then added, "We were in a discussion, and we figured it would be better to continue it rather than let time dictate what we were going to do." As player personnel director Tom Boyster added, "We figured if one of the guys that we were debating on was taken, we'd just jump in and take the other guy." Again, I have to ask, what the heck were you doing before this? Did you just start talking to each other the moment you got on the clock? You knew how the board was playing out. Heck, you had pick number 128 right before this. So surely when you were debating on players to take at that spot, you had a second guy in mind for pick number 130. And I'm extremely confident that the Cowboys taking Alundis Bryce at pick number 125 did not mess up your plans, since you already drafted a defensive back. This was just sheer And somehow, no one in the Giants organization got the memo to wrap up the conversation and try to come to a decision. If one team passed the Giants, then yes, it looks bad, but it doesn't look clueless. But nope, not one, not two, but 3 teams were able to leapfrog the Giants while they continued to converse and discuss the pick. The Dallas Cowboys leapfrogged them at pick number 130, the Buffalo Bills leapfrogged them at pick number 131, and the Carolina Panthers leapfrogged them at pick number 132. And the Panthers got an awfully good player with that pick that they got courtesy of New York's foolishness, as they chose Washington center Frank Garcia, who wound up playing 6 seasons for the team and started 84 games for the expansion club. You can thank the Giants for not having a care in the world as to why this somehow transpired. Finally, after 3 teams leapfrogged them, the Giants finally made up their minds and chose Tennessee linebacker Ben Talley. Instead of taking 5 minutes, they took a solid 10 or 12 minutes to make this pick. And the hysterical part is that at the end of the day, this deliberation was not worth it in the slightest bit. Make fun of the Cowboys all you want for what they did in 1964 by taking 6 hours to make a pick. But at least they made those 6 hours count, as they took Mel Renfro, one of the greatest defensive backs of all time, who made it to 10 Pro Bowls in his first 10 seasons, and who got inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He was also a key member of those great Cowboys teams of the 60s and the 70s. They didn't draft a player that did absolutely nothing in the NFL. Talley played 4 games in 1995 for the Giants, recording no tackles. There's a reason that you're not watching any highlights of Talley in the NFL, and that's because there literally aren't any. He never played again for the Giants after the 1995 season, as even though he was expected to have somewhat of a role with the team in 1996, he tore 3 ligaments in his left knee on the first day of camp, including the medial collateral, the anterior, and the posterior. and he missed the season. Talley played in 1998 with the Atlanta Falcons, recording 2 tackles and recovering a fumble in 8 games on a team that made it to their first Super Bowl in franchise history. But then, he never played again after that. Again, while the Giants were deliberating and letting 10% of the league pass them, the Panthers got their center of the future, and the Bills got a tight end that played a few seasons with them. The Giants got a linebacker that didn't record a single tackle, and they took 12 minutes to do it. What's the lesson here? For the love of all things good and pure, make your pick on time, because you just look really stupid if you don't. And at least if you're going to let the clock expire, you better have a good reason for it, like a trade falling through and mass confusion as to who was actually on the clock. The excuse of, this was a great move of strategery on our part because we couldn't come to a consensus, even though we had all the time in the world to do so, is so bad that it physically hurts my soul. Because as Giants fans found out in 1995, unlike OTAs, no, the clock is not optional. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.